Objections to Heroism. In the first part of this treatise, I deduced our moral obligations from the four cardinal virtues or subdivisions of right. So let us now apply the same classification in order to emphasize this conflict between what is right and what displays the false appearance of advantage. I have discussed wisdom, which cunning seems to mimic. I have also dealt with justice, which can never fail to be advantageous. So there remain two cardinal virtues. One of them can be described as heroism, or fortitude, and the other as the shaping and regulation of the character by temperance and self-control. First, fortitude. Ulysses believed that the trick he played was to his advantage, so at least say the tragic poets, though in Homer, our best authority, this reflection on his conduct is not found. The tragedians, however, represent Ulysses as deliberately evading military service by simulating madness. Such a scheme evidently cannot be described as morally right, but it could perhaps be interpreted as advantageous, seeing that it enabled him to keep his throne and go on living at ease in Ithaca with his parents, wife, and son. A life so peaceful, the argument could run, is better than any of the glory which days filled with toil and danger might provide. My own view, however, is that peacefulness of such a kind must be spurned and rejected, because it is wrong, and therefore cannot be advantageous. Imagine if Ulysses had persisted in his pretense of madness. How he would have been criticized! Even as matters were, in spite of his subsequent deeds of heroism in the war, he was attacked by Ajax in the following terms. As you all know, Ulysses was the man who instigated the leaders to swear their oath, yet he alone broke that oath when he began feigning madness to avoid joining up. And if Palamedes, with his shrewd sense, had not seen through this deceitful effrontery, Ulysses would have evaded the fulfillment of his vow forever. Ulysses' battles against the enemy, and even his battles against the waves, were nobler than this abandonment of the union of all Greece against the barbarians. But we have had enough of myths and of foreign parts. Let us turn to our own country and to real history. In Africa, while Marcus Atilius Regulus was consul for the second time, the enemy captured him by a trick. The Carthaginian commander was Xanthippus the Spartan, serving under Hannibal's father, Hamilcar. The enemy authorities then dispatched Regulus to Rome. His instructions were to meet the Senate and request the return of certain aristocratic Carthaginian prisoners. In case, however, he should fail in his mission, he placed himself under oath to return to Carthage. When Regulus arrived in Rome, the superficially advantageous course was obvious enough to him, but he rejected the advantage as unreal, as subsequent developments were to show. His interests seemed to require him to stay in his own country, at home with his wife and children, retaining his high position as consul and treating the defeat he had suffered as a misfortune which anyone might experience in time of war. And what do you think refuted the supposition that these were advantages? I will tell you. His heroism and his fortitude. And no more impressive authorities could be imagined. For the whole point of these virtues is that they reject fear, rise above all the hazards of this life, and regard nothing that can happen to a human being as unendurable. So what did Regulus do? He entered the Senate and reported his instructions, but at first he refused to express his own opinion in the matter, because as long as he was still bound by an oath sworn to the enemy, he refused to consider himself a member of the Senate. What happened next will cause him to be criticized for foolishness and acting against his own advantage. For he then proceeded to advise the Senate that the Carthaginian prisoners should not be sent back, since they were young men and capable officers, whereas he himself was old and worn out. His advice prevailed, and the prisoners were not released. So Regulus returned to Carthage. Even his love for his own homeland and his dear ones was not strong enough to hold him back. Yet he knew full well the refinements of torture which a ruthless foe had in store for him. Nevertheless, he believed that he had to obey his oath. When he rejoined his captors, they gave him no sleep until his death came to him. But even so, he was better off than if he had stayed at home, an aged ex-consul who had fallen into the enemy's hands and then perjured himself. The opposite thesis runs like this. Still, to argue explicitly against the release of the prisoners was foolish of Regulus. He would have done enough if he had merely refrained from advocating their release. But how could what he did be foolish if his advice furthered our national interests? Where is the foolishness then? No course which is harmful to the state can possibly benefit any of its individual citizens. People who argue that advantage is one thing and right another are uprooting the fundamental principles laid down by nature. Obviously, we all aim at our own advantage. We find that irresistibly attractive. No one can possibly work against his own interests. Indeed, no one can refrain from pursuing them to the best of his ability. But seeing that our advantage can only be found in good repute, honor, and right, priority and primacy must be accorded to these. The advantage that goes with them should be interpreted as their indispensable accompaniment rather than as a glorious objective in itself. But here are further arguments against Regulus's action. What is the significance of an oath anyway? Surely we are not frightened of Jupiter's anger. We have no reason to be, since all philosophers maintain that God is never angry and never hurtful. On this point, those who teach that God is himself free from cares and does not inflict them on others, and those who hold that he is ever active and at work are in full agreement. Besides, even if Jupiter had been angry, how could he possibly have damaged Regulus more than as things turned out? Regulus damaged himself. So there could be no justification for allowing scruples to overrule the advantage of the opposite course. Another criticism is this. Was fear of wrongdoing his motive? If so, he was misguided, for the following reasons. First, the proverb rightly insists that one should choose the least among evils, and the breach of faith which he would have committed by staying was not so bad as the torture which he suffered because of his return. Secondly, remember those lines from Accius? Have you broken your faith? But I never pledged it. To the faithless I pledge no faith. Though the king who spoke those words was evil, the sentiment that they record is nonetheless admirable. The next point raised by Regulus's detractors goes as follows. Just as we maintain that certain things seem advantageous but are not, so they maintain that certain things seem right but are not. In this case, for instance, they say, it looks as though Regulus did right in going back to be tortured for the sake of his oath, but his action proves not to be right all the same, because an oath extracted forcibly by an enemy need not be honored. Then their final objection is to the effect that something exceptionally advantageous often turns out to be right, contrary to the first appearances. So these are the principal lines of attack on Regulus's action. Let me deal with them in turn. First, the argument that there was no need to be afraid of anger and harm from Jupiter, because Jupiter is never angry or harmful. Now, this is only valid as a criticism of Regulus insofar as the same argument applies to any and every oath. But when we swear an oath, what we ought to have in mind is not so much fear of possible retribution as the sanctity of the obligation we have incurred. For an oath is backed by the whole force of religion. A promise you have solemnly made, with God as your witness, you must keep. This is not a question of the anger of the gods, which does not exist, but of right dealing and good faith. Gracious faith, borne on wings, an oath sworn in Jupiter's name, is the fine phrase of Aeneas. So whoever breaks his oath violates good faith, for which, as a speech of Marcus Porcius Cato the censor tells us, our ancestors chose a dwelling on the Capitol itself, next to the temple of Jupiter, the best and the greatest. One of the other objections was that even if Jupiter had been angry, he could not have damaged Regulus more than Regulus damaged himself. Correct, if pain were the only evil. But philosophers of the highest authority assert that, on the contrary, pain is not even the greatest among evils. In fact, it is not an evil at all. Regulus is our witness to this truth, and let us not disparage the force of his evidence. On the contrary, he seems to me the best of all possible witnesses. I can think of no more significant testimony than that of a leading Roman who insisted on doing his moral duty, even to the extent of submitting to torture. Then there was the criticism, choose the least among evils. But surely that cannot mean do wrong to keep out of trouble, seeing that the worst of all evils is wrongdoing. For since even an outward blemish such as a physical deformity is not very agreeable, a degeneracy of the soul itself faces us with something that is truly hideous and repellent. That is why the more rigorous school of philosophers go so far as to say that moral wrong is the only evil, and even those who are less strict do not hesitate to call it the worst of evils. While as to that quotation, I never pledged my faith, to the faithless I do not pledge it, the poet found the phrase apt because he had to make the words fit the character of Atreus, who appeared in this play. But anyone who sets out to argue that a pledge given to someone who is faithless need not be honored should take care, or he may, by his proposition, merely be opening the door to perjury. Indeed, even warfare has its legal obligations. An oath that you have sworn to an enemy very often has to be honored. That is to say, if you swore with the clear intention of keeping your word, then you must do so. If, on the other hand, you had no such idea, then breaking the oath is no perjury. Imagine, for example, that you have been captured by pirates, and you agree with them to pay a ransom for your life. Yet even if your agreement had been on oath, your failure to deliver the ransom would not count as fraudulent, for a pirate does not come into the category of regular enemies, since he is the enemy of all the world. As far as he is concerned, good faith and oaths do not come into the picture at all. For perjury is not simply swearing to what is false. It is the failure to honor an oath which, according to the traditional phrase, you have sworn upon your conscience. About the other sort of oath, Euripides aptly writes, "With my tongue I swore, my mind remains unsworn." Regulus, on the other hand, was not entitled to perjure himself by renouncing the terms and conditions of warfare agreed with the enemy. For our operations against them originated from a regular formal declaration of war, and relations with enemies thus defined are governed by our whole code of warfare, as well as by many international laws. This is proved by the action taken on certain occasions by our Senate in handing over distinguished Romans, manacled, to our enemies. During the second consulships of Titus Veturius and Spurius Postumius, we were defeated by the Samnites in the Battle of the Caudine Forks. Our legions were compelled to go under the yoke, and the consuls made peace. But because neither the assembly nor the Senate had authorized them to do so, they were handed over to the enemy. So at the same time were Tiberius Numicius and Quintus Maelius, then tribunes of the people, since they had favored the conclusion of peace, which their delivery to the Samnites was intended to repudiate. Moreover, the handing over of these men was actually urged and supported by Postumius himself, although he was one of their number. Many years later, the same thing happened to Gaius Hostilius Mancinus. He had made a treaty with the people of Numantia without the Senate's sanction. Lucius Furius Philus and Sextus Atilius Serranus moved that he should be given up to the Numantines, and Mancinus himself spoke in favor of that proposal. The motion was passed, and he was surrendered to the other side. Quintus Pompeius Rufus acted less honorably on another occasion when he spoke against a similar proposal and secured its rejection. This was a case of abandoning the right course in favor of an apparent advantage. In the former instances, on the other hand, the false appearance of advantage was outweighed by what was right. Another argument against Regulus was that an oath extorted by force need not be honored, as if force could influence a hero. Again, if Regulus only proposed to urge the Senate not to release the Carthaginian prisoners, why did he make the journey at all? There you are complaining about the finest feature of his action. He subordinated his own judgment to the Senate's. The purpose of his mission was to enable the Senate to judge the matter for itself. True, without his advice, the prisoners would certainly have been returned to the Carthaginians, and in that event Regulus would have remained safe in his own country. But he did not think this was to his country's advantage, and he felt it right to say so, and suffer accordingly. And then his critics argued that what is exceptionally advantageous often turns out to be right. However, they presumably mean is right, not turns out to be right, seeing that nothing can be advantageous unless it is right already. Things are advantageous because they are right. So all the exemplary actions of the past could hardly supply a more splendid and noble deed than that of Regulus. However, probably the most praiseworthy feature of the whole glorious incident is his own initiative in arguing against the release of the prisoners. True, his return to Carthage also seems to us admirable, but at that epoch he could not have done otherwise, so the merit belongs to the times rather than to the individual. For our ancestors believed that no guarantee of good faith was more powerful than an oath. That is proved by the 12 tables, the sacred laws, and the treaties insisted on good faith even with an enemy. Inquiries and penalties from the censors tell the same story. Cases relating to oaths were those for which they reserved their most rigorous judgments. The dictatorship of Lucius Manlius Capitolinus Imperiosus, son of Iulus, provided an instance. Marcus Pomponius, tribune of the people, announced an indictment of the dictator because he had prolonged for a few days his tenure of office. Pomponius also accused Manlius of banishing his own son Titus, Titus Manlius Torquatus as he was called later, and compelling him to live in the country away from all human society. But when Titus heard of his father's predicament, he hastened to Rome, the story goes, and early one morning called at Pomponius's house. When his presence was reported, Pomponius assumed that the motive for the young man's visit was an angry determination to bring fresh evidence against his father. The tribune rose from his bed, cleared the room of witnesses, and gave orders that the visitor should be admitted. But Titus no sooner entered than he drew his sword and vowed to kill Pomponius on the spot unless he promised on oath to withdraw the charge against the elder Manlius. Terrified, Pomponius did as he was told. Later, reporting the incident in the assembly, he explained that because of what had happened, he was obliged to abandon the case, and so he withdrew the charge against the dictator. Such was the reverence felt for an oath in those days. The young man in that story was the same Titus Manlius who at the battle by the Anio was challenged single combat by a Gaul. He killed the Gaul and pulled off his collar, Torques, thus acquiring the surname Torquatus. Later, when consul for the third time, this exceptionally distinguished man defeated and routed the Latins near Vaseris. He had shown remarkable indulgence towards his father, although to his own son he behaved with ruthless severity. When we praise Regulus for keeping his oath, we must censure 10 Romans concerned in another occurrence. After the Battle of Cannae, Hannibal dispatched 10 of his Roman prisoners on parole as envoys to the Senate. If the story that they omitted to return to the Carthaginians is true, they were gravely at fault, since, in the event of failure to arrange an exchange of prisoners, they had sworn to go back to the camp and to the enemy who are now its occupants. Their subsequent behavior is variously described. Polybius, an astoundingly reliable authority, reports that 9 out of the 10 aristocratic envoys duly returned to Hannibal when their mission to the Senate had proved unsuccessful, but that the 10th found a reason for remaining at Rome. Shortly after his initial departure, this man had turned back and re-entered the camp on the pretext that he had forgotten something, and now he argued that by this return to the camp, he had released himself from his oath. But he was wrong. Far from rehabilitating perjury, deliberate deception makes things worse. So his cunning was merely foolishness, perversely masquerading as intelligence. He was a sly rogue, and the Senate directed that he should be taken back to Hannibal in chains. But the most significant part of the story is this. The 8,000 prisoners in Hannibal's hands had not been captured by him in battle, and had equally not fled from the battle to save their lives. The consuls, Marcus Aemilius Paulus and Gaius Terentius Varro, had left them behind in the camp. Their ransom could have been cheaply arranged, yet the Senate did not take this step owing to a desire to implant in our soldiers the lesson that they must conquer or die. Polybius described the effect of this news on Hannibal. Such heroic courage displayed by the Senate and people of Rome in the face of disaster plunged him into despair. Here, then, is another case of right outweighing apparent advantage. However, Gaius Achillius, the writer of a Roman history in Greek, gives another version. According to him, not one but several of the envoys played this trick of re-entering the camp in the hope of releasing themselves from their oaths, and they incurred the deepest ignominy from the censors. So let us conclude this discussion. Obviously, no action performed in a timid, base, degraded, crushed spirit can be a source of advantage, because such actions are immoral, offensive, and wrong. And that would have been the proper description for what Regulus had done, if his advice concerning the prisoners had been influenced by his own seeming advantage and his desire to stay home, rather than by the interests of his country.